All right, I'll go ahead and get us started. I am Jess Ambler. I'm the director of the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum here at Hollins University. And this evening, I am thrilled to welcome artist Edward Steffanni to Hollins. I met Edward when he was a visiting assistant professor of printmaking here at Hollins last year, and he was kind enough to invite me to do a studio visit with him. This visit was the genesis of a lasting friendship, as well as the Wilson Museum's current exhibition, God-Shaped Hole. Originally from Ohio, Edward Steffanni received his Master of Fine Arts in Printmaking from the Rhode Island School of Design. His work has been exhibited nationally, and he was included in the 2025 New Voices cohort and exhibition at the Print Center in New York City. He has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation grant twice, a research grant from the Rhode Island School of Design to study Maiolica and religious imagery in Italy, a Phoenix Rising Printmaking Award, and an Ohio Arts Council Award from the Ohio State Fair Fine Arts Exhibition Committee. He is currently an artist in residence at the Worcester Center for Crafts. In Edward's interdisciplinary practice, he examines the relationships between queerness, concealment, nature, and spirituality. Utilizing hunting themes, his work occupies spaces where queer people have historically been excluded, spaces traditionally deemed masculine, to explore torment, vulnerability, and healing. What strikes you immediately upon visiting the gallery is the broad variety of media Edward incorporates in God-Shaped Hole. He is a printmaker who works with fiber arts, performance, and ceramics, and he is continually pushing himself to try more and experiment further. What we are witnessing in the exhibition is a body of work in process. The series began before the exhibition, new work was created immediately leading up to the exhibition, and it will continue to grow and transform after the work leaves our museum. I think that this creative arc gets to the idea of a God-shaped hole, the concept that there will always be something within each of us that remains unresolved, and that we will return to and tend to at multiple points in our lives, responding to external stimuli and internal contemplation. I hope that, like me, your visit to the exhibition and this opportunity to hear the artist speak about his work will be an invitation to explore, question, reflect, and heal. Welcome.
Wow, thank you, Jess, for that introduction. I hope I can live up to that. Let me just move this little guy out of here. If I can find the cursor. Oops. There we go. Sorry, I'm a little rusty with my Zoom. Hey, it's still there. Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit about my work generally, and then slowly kind of show you three major bodies of work. So I'll be talking through the genesis of this work, which was the Friend of Dorothy series, and then moving to my graduate thesis, and then this current body of work. Before I get to that, actually, I'd like to just thank my partner Wesley, who's here in the front row, and my family for always being a source of inspiration and support for my craziness. And then also the Eleanor D. Wilson team, just everyone there, Janet, Jess especially, helping kind of synthesize and really help me think through this project. Laura, Reagan, just everyone there. And then the Hollins Art Department and students. Last year was a really important time in my life, and I'm really grateful to be back and see so many familiar faces. And then also the Worcester Center for Crafts, where I'm currently an artist in residence, particularly Tom O'Malley, who helped me birth the major piece in the exhibition. I call her Eve, the deer in the work. I have a little video of him helping me load her 50-pound body into the kiln. So I'm very grateful for him. And then also the RISD Spur Fund for funding my initial study into this project to study Maiolica in Italy, as well as Elizabeth Greenshield's grant, which funded a series of prints that I made for this exhibition. All right, so off to the races. So just a little bit about my practice. I'm overly generally into understanding the relationships between community, spirituality, and God in my work, and also how those relate to nature. Having grown up in Middle America, I've always been like aware of this weird phenomenon that happens as a queer person with a concealable identity, how we can move throughout spaces and choose to when we can conceal and when we can reveal those parts of ourselves, and how that takes a toll on us, that sexual minority stress, and how that concealment is always on the back burner, and how that can affect us as queer people, how we navigate and grow as individuals. And then additionally, just nature. My early work was really focused on place and trees and thinking about kind of peeling back the layers of bark of a tree and thinking how that can relate to kind of this journey inward. Because as queer people, we always have to deal through this trauma and trying to process that. I was thinking about that through the imagery of a tree. And then as the work continued progressing, I was thinking about surveillance as well, not only surveillance out in the world, but also this is surveillance that we internalize, how that controls our own self and our identity. And then, as mentioned by Jess, my work really expands many different mediums. So I'm trained as a printmaker. You'll see that my graduate thesis was all ceramics, which is very funny, and also performance. But all of this really gets at my interest in material and how the material can lead me throughout the work. So I have these overarching themes that I'm kind of interrogating, but also being able to work with the material itself leads me to greater understanding of the concepts that I'm working through. And for me, that's in a way to kind of embody the making. And I want to include this quote from Glenn Adamson, who says, "Where artistic practice has been oriented to optical effects, craft is organized around material experience." And for me, that is how I approach making work. Being able to lose myself in my work is really important. Being able to work in laborious processes like printmaking, ceramics, and performance, they're all about the material and my own body's relationship to the material. And on that note, I want to talk about one of the first influences where I started to think about craft in my work. And so, I went to a small conservative university in Ohio, and I happened to go to the Cleveland Museum of Art on a class field trip. And then I saw this piece by Jared French, a magical realist who used classical techniques such as egg tempera to think about his own ideas of queerness and this idea of kind of evading questions about your sexuality and repression. And seeing something like this, where an artist was working with not only his queer identity, but also thinking through material in a way that was so poignant. And this was made in 1947. And for me, and probably 2017 to see this work, which just kind of got to like the heart of the issue. And so this led me to start experimenting with egg tempera because of its relationship to religious iconography. And that was when I started to think about the surface that I'm working with, how I can labor over and meditate through my practice, besides just the optical illusionism that I had been working with, but thinking about how the material can also tell a story. And so that really set me up for my entire work. So always visit the museum. It's always important. So this next body of work happened during a little tiny event called COVID-19. So I had just gotten into grad school in 2019, and we were forced to go back home. And that actually turned out to be a really wonderful gift to me. Because when I had moved from Ohio to Rhode Island, I really kind of struggled to understand who I was as an artist, having been queer and understood myself through that Middle American lens, being in Rhode Island where people were just like, yeah, you're queer. Okay, what next? And so when I went back home, I started really thinking about my own journey and starting to turn my look inward. And so I started digging into my own personal archive. And so I was looking at this first instance of queerness in me where it was recognized, and that was when I would wear my sister's Dorothy dress because I was obsessed with Wizard of Oz. Still kind of am. And so that was the first instance where my family kind of recognized this queerness. And so what was interesting about that is that here I am, a little kid putting on something, and when actually that act of costuming actually showed something that was interior. And so that experience kind of led me throughout my practice since this moment. And so I created this work called Friend of Dorothy, which is a kind of another reference to kind of queer history where folks would say, "Are you a friend of Dorothy?" and mixed company so that they could say, "Oh, are you queer?" Instead of saying, "Are you queer?" you say, "Are you a friend of Dorothy?" And if they say, "Who's Dorothy?" And then they're like, "Oh, okay, it's not safe space." If they say, "Oh, yes, I'm a very good friend of Dorothy," then you know it's okay to pursue. And so I was really interested in the act of concealment throughout queer history and well as my own work. And so I made this piece where I built a fence in my family's farm. And so I built the fence in the Dorothy dress, and then I wanted to restage a scene from The Wizard of Oz where she actually limbos on the fence. And so that kind of moment where she is limboing, it really, for me, symbolized for us as queer people how we limbo between spaces and how there were always kind of searching for something else, like thinking of the going over the rainbow, always hoping for something. Another person that was really influential in this work was Jose Esteban Munoz, who talks about queer futurity as queerness is always being something that we're reaching for, something that we can never attain. And and that was written quite a few years ago, but it's still super important. And so in this piece, I have a little clip of me building the fence and then ultimately restaging a scene from The Wizard of Oz in the Dorothy dress. Then I'll fast forward. Then I'll mute this. I don't know if I can mute it, but oh, there we go. And so in this, when I after this piece was completed in 2020, in the summer of 2020, we were able to go back to Rhode Island, and I started thinking about how am I going to convey this experience to the viewer. Just imagining showing it in this space on a screen. Yes, you can hear the wind whistling through your ears, but that texture that I felt in the experience, that embodied experience was really important to me, feeling the grass beneath my toes, taking off my work boots and putting on the ruby slippers. That moment was really important to me. And so in this, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking I really need something texturally to have to show the video. And so I was taking a ceramics and print class at RISD, and then I decided to make a series of frames where the video plays in these frames. And then I was able to put that texture back in the work that was lost in the initial video recording. And so as I continued working in ceramics, I started thinking about this idea of trompe l'oeil of things that are not exactly what they seem to be, thinking about how as queer people we're always deemed as unnatural. And so I created this series of tree trunks later that were kind of working through those ideas of camouflage. And so this Friend of Dorothy work really set me up with this idea of camouflage and how costuming can be able to create this like story that reveals more about myself. So these are just some little detail shots of that work. And then as I started thinking about my graduate thesis, about how I wanted to create a new body of work. I was thinking about Saint Teresa of Avila, who has been really influential in my work. And she talks about this idea of the soul as being as a diamond within a castle. And she says, I thought of the soul as resembling a castle formed of a single diamond or a very transparent crystal containing many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions. And so I was thinking of this own interior journey that I was on in grad school, trying to slowly uncover this jewel within myself, this queerness that I had so often um, that was kind of encrusted and hidden, and thinking about how I can nurture that. And so I created a series of work where there was a I made those tree trunks, but then I also did a performance where I created a ceramic headpiece that was a concealment bird's nest that was over my head, where I took it off in the performance and revealed a glittery covered face. And so, as I mentioned, master's in printmaking, and then this is the work that was on display. And so these are all clay work. And so a lot of this work was really just me delving into the material and really just following the work where it wants to go. And these are all hand painted ceramic pieces. So again, thinking about peeling back the layers of a tree and thinking about my own interior journey as a queer person. And then this work kind of brings me to one of the earliest work that's in the show, which is a triptych of cattails in winter. So this work was made before I even thought of God-shaped hole. And so what's interesting is here is the this winter scene, which is then bookended by the most recent piece, which has a winter scene again. And that is something that wasn't necessarily intentional as I was thinking about um, the work as it continued developing. I realized there was this theme of winter throughout the work present and how that can relate to the passing of time. I just want to read a little poem that I wrote for this piece as well as the previous ceramic object. Um, I remember seeing cattails swaying in the wind. During the winter, some of the cattails bend and hunch together under the weight of the snow like birds nestled together. You and I are like cattails in winter, your feet, my body next to yours, feeling your warm, hairy skin against mine, protecting me from the cold. When did I know you? When did you know me? Did it begin with the tap on the screen, the hello, the clicking of my heels? The deeper I go into you, the more I know myself. I find my sort of paradise peeling back the layers of you and me like stripping the bark on a tree. And so this poem for me was really starting to kind of wrestle with these ideas of how we can start to kind of shelter and find a home within ourselves as well as within other um, people in our relationship. And what was really interesting is as I started thinking about God-shaped hole, how this theme of winter kind of carried throughout the work, which was fitting since our show install was delayed from the snow as well. And so during 2022, I was fortunate to receive a RISD Spur Fund, which set this show up. And so I started this work with the premise of wanting to go to Laverna to see the Chapel of the Stigmata, which is where it's a site where St. Francis was said to have received the stigmata, the holes where Christ was crucified. And so I went there really trying to look at like the wounds that we carry as queer people and trying to see that help to figure out how I want to visualize that in my own work. And so this site is where St. Francis was said to have been tempted by the devil to actually jump off. And actually, it was said that the rocks actually grabbed him and pulled him in. And that kind of imagery has kind of stayed with me for the past 4 years. And thinking about how nature itself can kind of be a healing and protection from society when it can be so terrible at times. And so this is one of the pieces that I looked at in Laverna. Here we have St. Francis witnessing the lamentation of Christ. And for me, really, was really important with this research was trying to see how artists have shown grief and how I can start to kind of convey that in my own language. And so I was able to study Maiolica, which is a glaze technique using painting with diluted colorants on an unfired glazed surface. And this was again another way of me to think about how I can play with surface, how I can think about painting as another way, in a different way than just oil on a canvas. And so here's a little example of the process. So these are all colorants painted onto unfired glaze, and when they're fired, the glaze fuses together. And for me, that process of transformation is really important in my work and how material can change over time. And so as I continued thinking about this idea of a God-shaped hole of these things that we conceal and reveal, I started thinking about hunting in nature and how we as queer people are always kind of hunted in society. There's always this cyclical nature where there's moments of freedom, like the sex liberation movement, and then all of a sudden there's a crackdown, and then just ebbs and flows. And so I really was thinking about the idea of the panopticon, this prison system. And Michel Foucault talks about the panopticon and says that visibility is a trap. And oftentimes it feels that way. Whenever there's this hypervisibility, there's always a flip side. Not to say that visibility isn't important. It's a really beautiful thing, but there's always this ebb and flow within culture. And so when I started this work, I was thinking about the deer stand and how that was similar to a watchtower itself. And certain things that were influences were the drag queen bands, and then later the Bud Light boycott, which was bizarre. And um, it started making me research into queer history, like the AIDS epidemic, the lavender scare, the pansy craze. And this was really a way to kind of deal with my own trauma because whenever I was coming into contact with the just social media, going on Twitter and seeing all this vitriol, I just like felt this festering wound. It was just like, oh my God, why do I keep feeling so bad? I go to pick up a beer and I see Bud Light next to all these empty shelves of other beers because people are upset about this random 10-second clip. Um, I started really trying to analyze that and realizing that this isn't just me. There's so many other queer people who have these wounds that we have to tend to and work through as people. And so I really started with this work thinking about this internalized kind of prison that some queer people live in, especially myself, where we internalize these systems of oppression and how this relates to the panopticon, which this Foucault writes really beautifully about this, how in this system there's a singular man in the watchtower, and so all the folks in the prison system, they just assume that they're under surveillance so that they start to kind of internalize it, so they kind of police themselves. And I think this happens a lot with queer people where where we start to get ourselves in line so that we don't face any backlash and what that does. And as we grow up and process things, we have to slowly break those systems down again. And so this is the one of the earliest illustrations of me trying to figure out how I'm going to reconfigure this deer stand as a site to think about this surveillance of the queer body. And so on my family's property, there was this deer stand. And so I wanted to kind of reconfigure it and think about how I can kind of make it almost a queer kind of chapel in a way. And then there's a little quote from Foucault. And so in this piece, which was the first iteration of the hunting stand, which was then reinterpreted for this exhibition in a tent form, I took this hunting stand and then created a series of ceramic tondos that show different images of different scenes, a deer with its tongue out, two male figures embracing in the woods, and then a kind of narrative in a pattern where it shows kind of sleeping as well as fleeing and creating a narrative within the print itself. And I just have a little image, a couple images of the process itself. So I came across this pattern at Aramont School of Craft when I was taking a queer textiles course. And so I was really interested in this pattern on the right, where it wasn't just a kind of stable image. There was this narrative and movement throughout the pattern itself. And that made me really want to create a pattern that was able to convey a narrative of being hunted and fleeing. And so I was really interested also in the simplicity of Robert Gober's work, especially his patterns. And so that influenced this next pattern, which has been beautifully recreated in the exhibition. And so I started this work with a series of hand-colored etchings. And so for me, being able to work in printmaking and have a labor-intensive medium was a chance for me to be able to stay with the image longer. I've always enjoyed drawing on copper plates more than drawing by itself because of how much time it takes me to work through an image and go through the several rounds of proofing. It just gives me more time to sit with an image longer. And so I digitized these etchings and then created this pattern that lines the walls of this hunting stand. And so here we have a deer kind of resting, and in the shadow in the creek, there's a hunter looming. We have deer running over a fence, and then we have a father and son hunting, and then men carrying away their trophy. And so for me, what was really important in this work was being able to think about not only this idea of hunting, but also desire and creating a complicated narrative, how it's not as readily clear what is going on in the piece. Are the people being hunted? Are they hunting? And creating this complicated narrative for the viewer. And so here's another detail shot. This piece was later reworked with more oil paint on top of it. And again, as was mentioned in the introduction, a lot of my work is always a work in progress, leaving it open-ended, never putting a period on the work, allowing myself to revisit it as deemed necessary. And this is also clay too. And then as I was continuing to make work in this series, I was starting to think about surveillance not only as a singular kind of moment, but also as this idea of evidence, how queer people are always kind of trying to avoid evidence as a way to avoid being punished. Um, Jose Esteban Munoz talks about how queerness has a especially vexed relationship with evidence because it's often used to penalize and discipline queer desires, connections, and acts. And so for the series of work that's on display, the digital collages with silkscreen on top, I took a series of images of me and my partner in our domestic space with a trail cam. And so for me, that was a way to not only create a kind of eerie sort of kind of surveillance state image, but also to allow moments of improvisation. So I can't click the shutter speed or click the shutter, whatever the word is. I'm losing the word. Is motion activated. So allowing the moment itself to be captured and giving it up to chance was really important. And then being able to react to that moment was a part of the work. So I took a series of these images over the span of a couple days and then continued making work with those images as a way to continually think about the ways that we're not only policed um, outside of our living spaces, but also how our own private acts are always under watch. And then as I was continuing to make this work and really to delve deeper into myself, I had some health issues arise. I was diagnosed with cancer in 2023, and had this series of digital scans that I eventually revisited after the cancer was dealt with and I could process it. I started going through my own medical records and thinking about not only how this is showing these inside moments, which are very weird if you ever see digital scans of your body. It's very strange. Um, but also thinking about how queer people are always under a microscope. So the title of this work is called High Risk Homosexual. And that is actually taken from my medical records from my first doctor's visit, where I told them my sexual history, and I was labeled that I had high risk homosexual behavior as well as obesity unspecified. They didn't highlight the high risk homosexual behavior. I highlighted it. But just seeing that written was just so strange in 2023, just to see that label, and how there's always these moments in society where you're just like, oh my God, we're still kind of there, you know? And so this work was kind of looking at that. And there's also some little references to St. Francis. I don't know if you can see him. He's like right here, this internalized prison. And so thinking about this kind of self again, and using this religious iconography and kind of building layers within this work. Um, and so I wanted to create this link between the self-imposed and forced kind of prison systems. There's a little reference to the panopticon, but it's kind of hidden, but it's there. And then within this series, there's also one piece where it's one of the only instances where I actually use language in my work. And for me, this was really important to have moments where is there's no getting around it. Like this says, "Shh, I'm hunting faggots." I can't do accents, so I'm not going to try to do Elmer Fudd's voice. But thinking about these moments where there's you're always kind of taken down a peg. Every queer person, especially a queer man that's grown up in a rural area, has an instance with this word being yelled at him at a gas station, having it texted to him randomly. But thinking about how down to the very bone, this word itself can hold such depth and complexity. It's been reclaimed in some ways, but how that word itself could be this wound was really important to the work. And so with this work, there's the images with the trail cam, but there's also vintage gay porn as well. Kind of there's a man laying on a hay bale. So thinking about how all of these things can coexist at the same time was really important. As I was like thinking about the work, there's always this like ebb and flow between just everyday life, how there's desire, there's sex, there's pain, there's politics, and how all these things can converge was really important in my choice of choosing collage where things can exist simultaneously. And then this was one of the last pieces that I made in this series. And so not only is there some surveillance imagery, that has includes some images of Joan Rivers and RuPaul talking about culture, but also some images of an Xbox Cabela's game that I found in my family's archive. And so I used that and then played it for like 2 hours. And so one thing that was really poignant in this video, which finds its way back into the work in the tent, that I'll talk about later, is this was back in, let me think, 2015. It was close before Joan Rivers passed away. But Drew Paul is talking about how there's these little pockets of time where queer people are accepted, but then those openings close, they open again. And for me, that was a really poignant way to kind of summarize a lot of what I've been thinking about. And so I included those quotes within this piece, and having those sandwiched with a kind of gun, rifle, and then a little crucifix as well. Another important part too was thinking about this relationship between queer men and women, how we have these icons that we latch onto, and how those are ways that we can also experience queer liberation as well as experiencing these strong women. And then the last work is called Passing. And I wanted to just show this work to kind of reference how images kind of live in my head. And I'm always thinking about um, how I can reconvey these images and reimagine them. And so if you look on the image on the left, that was made in Italy, the Maiolica piece. And then that reference image that was used for that photograph made its way, excuse me, back into the work of a shadow. And for me, this piece was really talking about this idea of passing, not only passing as straight, passing as queer, but also the passing of time and how there's this kind of merging between worlds. And then for the last couple prints that were made for this work, we're dealing with those same topics, but also incorporated handmade paper making. And this series of work used this circular shape, the tondo again, to also think about the idea of like looking through a scope, how I'm trying to focus the viewer into the work itself by using this circumference of the plate to an impression to guide the viewer. And this piece was also another work where I had been living with this image that I had taken in 2021. And then I finally found the right way to convey it. So thinking about different ways to live with imagery. And this also has a little reference to a tent, which is actually a tattoo I got all the way back in undergrad, which is interesting because my final piece for this show was a tent. And then one of the other pieces, you might recognize this image because it's similar to the image in the Tondos. This incorporates handmade paper that has gene pulp in it as well. And so again, thinking about different ways I can translate material to focus the viewer into and bring them into the work. For me, these series of etchings were really important to create a softness where the line itself is doing all the work and having these little pops of color to kind of bring the viewer into it. This was also motivated by the fact that whenever we're moving in nature or just going through everyday life, there's these little things that come call our attention, like a little wrapper out in the grass or a little shiny, shimmery thing that catches our eye, thinking about how nature and these experiences of visual stimuli pull us in. And so I wanted to create that for the work. And then the final piece is kind of a flip side of the image of me carrying the fence. Um, Here we have layers of transparency with using chincolle, which is a process of printing while simultaneously gluing sheets of paper down to a supporting sheet. So here using paper layered on top of paper behind it to create areas of transparency. And that was really influenced by my own work in digital collage as well. So um, a lot of the work spans different media, but I've been really thinking about transparency and concealment through different media. And this is another image where I saw it back in 2018, this crucifix in front of a church. And so it took me 8 years. Is that 8 years to make it, which is kind of bonkers. But just these images that keep coming up and then find their way into the work. And then one of the major pieces that I actually made here before I moved to Rhode Island is Dormant Desires. And so this piece was really thinking about this idea of dormancy and sleeping and how within us there's always these moments of dreaming, but also there's these moments where we're on the break of something. So thinking about dreams in that way. And this incorporates handmade paper, cattails from Ohio, and then there's this image of me sleeping while a deer nests um, nearby. And then one thing with this particular work was with all the craziness of the political climate, I really was trying to think about how can create this work while having moments of brevity because it's like, God, I can't keep thinking about this surveillance state and all this dark imagery. I wanted to create moments where I was tending to myself and trying to nurture that delicate side of my work. Because everything felt so dark, it feels like so easy to fall into this rage of like, oh my God, screw you guys. Like, I want to be crazy. But really trying to take my time and really live with the work and nurture that delicate side that can so often be eroded by culture. And this work is a silk aquatint, which is basically the process of painting onto silkscreen mesh. So as you start painting with thick layers of acrylic paint and medium. It removes the texture of the silk screen mesh, so it prints lighter. And so for me, this is another labor-intensive process where I'm slowly uncovering the image, laboring over it, pulling it up. And then the process of intaglio, where you're putting ink into the plate, swirling, uncovering, that's really important in the process. And this is a large piece, so it takes an hour to print, very time intensive. And so being able to print that large on handmade paper was really important to be able to form a relationship with the viewer and their body. And so that also directs my choice and scale as well. And so the last two pieces I want to talk about are the two major pieces on the floor of the exhibition. And so when I started my residence at the Worcester Center for Crafts, I wasn't planning on making a 6 foot piece of a deer, but I had this image come to me of a deer licking its wound. And for me, I had been thinking about wounds. I thought about God-shaped hole. I thought about St. Francis, but it wasn't until I saw this piece and thought about the deer licking its wound where it was like, oh my God, that's the distillation of the entire project. Like this wound that we have to nurture and tend to. And I came across this work from 14,000 BCE. Those aren't historians in here. You might fact check me. But this image of a bison licking an insect bite was really poignant because here we have thousands and thousands of years ago, this instance of a wound. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to make a work that relates to this. And so I started going into more deeply into ceramic art history. I had looked at maiolica, which is an Italian Renaissance technique. And so I wanted to go a little bit further back to create something that evokes this kind of prehistoric, strange surface that always animates these objects. And so I started working with terra sigillata, which is Latin for sealed earth. And so I did several tests experimenting with the form because this is the first time I really worked with the full 3D image of an animal or figure. So I took several rounds of doing several little studies before I decided on the large 4 foot by 2 foot sculpture. And so I continued testing with this terra sigillata. And so terra sigillata is an ultra refined slip that when placed on greenware clay, so unfired clay, you burnish it. So there's this process of tenderness where you're having to rub it with a stone or a plastic bag or a cloth to create this soft lustered appearance, which actually seals it and makes it watertight. And that was used for jars. And so for me, this process itself was really important because it created this moment where I have to tend to this work and tend to the material itself. And so as I was looking at terra sigillata, I was thinking about how am I going to fire this? Because I don't want to use glaze. I don't want to cover it in some satiny color, or I just want it to be the bare clay. So I decided to use Sagar, which is an atmospheric firing technique, kind of similar to raku, but it's basically the process of coating the clay with chemicals and oxides and combustible materials that, when fired, create an atmosphere and create these effects on the surface of the work itself. So you can't really anticipate exactly what it's going to look like. Granted, I tested a lot to make sure it wasn't I wasn't going to ruin this sculpture, but this was another process where the material led me to do this process. But I feel like I'm always kind of on the precipice of something and experimenting and just really believing in the material and letting this experimentation lead me. And so I did several tests experimenting with the Sagar technique. And then it was time to do the big deer. I kind of refer to the deer as my mistress because it was like 2 months of constantly being at the studio with this deer. Because if you ever worked in ceramics, you can't let the deer, you can't let the clay dry. You have to tend to it. And so what was really interesting was during happy hour with Jess and Rita of Kaler, I was talking about the process of wrapping this deer to make sure that she didn't dry. And Rita had mentioned that you're kind of tending to the wound itself in the process. And so it was like, oh my God, you're so right that there's this a moment, these moments of the creative process where you are being tender, you're taking care of something. And this deer was very much that way, being thinking about how I can tend to this wound, make this sculpture, and how that material itself in the process can also add to the meaning of the work. And so this is the progress photos. I was so glad I took them. And so the piece is modular. So the deer itself is solid, but the rest of the base is all separate. And so as I was continuing to work in this with the piece, I started using, this is the terra sigillata before it's fired. And so once it's fired, it turns that beautiful terracotta color. And so if you remember me mentioning earlier that you have to burnish the piece to actually create that luster, so you have to burnish the entire piece with a cloth or stone. And so it creates this really intimate moment between you and the piece itself. And here's some process photos. So this is the deer after it's been fired, which is very nerve-wracking. A little photo of me and Tom and Sophie, one of the other artists in residence, loading her into the kiln. This is why Tom got a special shout out. And then after that, I used the Sager technique to create the atmospheric quality that you see in the exhibition. So this is unfired clay that has chemicals pasted on it. There's copper wire, which creates black marks in the piece, as well as steel wool, which creates black marks itself. And then different materials are soaked in chemicals that then are covered. And then I cover the piece in tinfoil. So it looks like a giant turkey, which kind of makes it less poetic, but it is creating an atmosphere and sealing the piece while it's fired. And then once it's fired, there's this moment of uncovering. And so this material is really important because there is this kind of spiritual side where I can't anticipate exactly what is going to happen. And so just letting the piece be what it is was really important. And so this is the final piece. And so there's all these different little moments where the Sager technique created these moments of blushing, of dusty kind of cloudiness that created this hopefully created this prehistoric um, surface that I was aiming for. And this is copper wire. And creating these little moments was really important because I had already made, excuse me, the series of prints where there's a lot of transparency. So I wanted to create layers upon layers and think about the surface in a new way. And so this was a way to do that. And then this is the tree trunk, which was the last piece to the large deer sculpture. And this is before it's fired. And then this was the first time I actually saw it all together because I didn't have the space to put it together. And then if you know when you go into the exhibition, you might notice a little Bud Light can. And so this was a little recall to that first one of those early moments where they had the Bud Light controversy and thinking about how we're constantly under surveillance, and there's always these moments in time where we're surveyed. Okay. And now for the last piece of the exhibition that I'll talk about is Who May Dwell. And this piece, it relates to a psalm that states, Who may dwell in your sacred tent? And then it lists all these different positive qualities. Um, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, casts no slur on others. And so for me, this piece was really important to not only reconfigure the hunting stand in a way that's actually accessible. Not everyone can go to my family's farm and climb up this ladder and go into the tent. But I also wanted to create a dwelling place that becomes another sacred space, but also not necessarily thinking solely about hunting, but also thinking about shelter, which also felt like a really nice complement to the piece. I'm thinking about a deer licking its wound in this historic reference point, and thinking about how I can create this moment of shelter within my own work for the viewer to rest. Um, and so I created this work um, with organza, dyed gauze, cotton, vintage fabric, and then there's also some terracotta from the previous installation. And this was really informed by this work from this artist and who made a work called Re-Enchanting the World at the Polish Pavilion for the Venice Biennale 2022. And she made this series of work, which was kind of a manifesto thinking about the Roma identity, and kind of using kind of these examples of Jacques Callot of the journey of the Roma people. So thinking about how I can decolonize this language of the Roma people, and seeing her using fabric was really important to me in this massive installation, and thinking about how I immediately have a relationship to the fabric. I can feel it and I can imagine feeling it on my hands. And thinking about how that warmth could be translated in this hunting stand to create a moment where the viewer feels safe and can feel at peace. And so, towards the end of this body of work, at least for this exhibition, I finally was able to make this hunting stand. And I wanted it not only to be a stand where there's texture and there's fabric. I also wanted to house something that shows this history of surveillance of the queer body. And so I went through the Internet Archive and just delved into different resources and compiled them and had them playing alongside a performance of mine. And so in the video that plays in the performance, it has some clips as well as some audio from the Boys Beware um, video from 1961, which was used by police to talk about the dangers of queerness. So it talks about queer men, particularly as kind of threats, as being kind of pedophiles as well, and how there's dangers that never meet the eye. Talks about Ralph. This example here, it shows a man grooming another man, a young boy, and so showing this to kids at that in the 1960s, um, seeing that and how similar the language is about queer people being groomers, and how this language continually gets recycled in different ways, whether it's men or drag queens, how this language pops up in culture was really important for me to reference in the work. And so here's a little clip of the where the Boys Beware is projected onto the side of the deer stand. And then alongside that, I had previously looked at the pansy craze, so I wanted to reference Jean Mallon, a drag queen from the 20s who made this song, That's What's the Matter with Me, where she talks about being queer and it being recognized in her family. And she talks about um, my mother wanted a girl, my father wanted a boy, and when they both got me, they both were satisfied. And kind of thinking about how there's this funniness to it, and there's this humor, but then there's also this deep sadness to it. And so this song, and mostly its entirety, plays in the exhibition. And this song was from 1933. And then there's also a song from Irving Kaufman called Masculine Women, Feminine Men from 1926. So a whopping 100 years later, we have a song that could be written today, which is very interesting to hear. And then the last piece of this work that I'll talk about is different from others. So if you've seen the film, or if you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. But this film was from 1919, and it was during 1920. So 1920s, Berlin was kind of a queer haven, and this film, watching it today, it seems really radical and even for that time, it was kind of crazy. Later, when the Nazis rose to power, a lot of it was burned, as well as anything related to queerness. But what the reason that this piece was included, the clips of it were included in the video, was the whole story discusses this musician who falls in love with another musician and who is then blackmailed for being queer. His concert is canceled, and then he ultimately commits suicide. And then that there's also some language within it where it's actually very empathic of as well, talking about queerness is not something unnatural, it's just a variation, which that would be radical in the 60s being said. But then as the Nazis rose to power, this film began to be only bits and fragments of it. And so for me, this piece was really about trying to create almost an archive of the queer experience. And so what I'll end this video with just a little clip of the video that plays in the tent, and then we'll open up to questions.
But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. Dangers involved that never meet the eye. The eye, meet the eye, the eye, the eye, meet the eye.
He was going to come out of the closet. Hello? Hi. All right. Hello, my God.
Involved that never meet Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of...
I can't believe, I mean, during the 80s, I couldn't believe some of the things that people, even gay people, became very conservative during the 80s,
Which is
you know?
the rooster, which is the hen? It's my...
But it will close again. It's not always that way.
You really think it would close again?
Absolutely. That's the history of mankind.
Now if I only were the boy my father thinks me, or if I only were the girl my mother craves, when I look into a mirror, a big strong man I find, but when I see a battleship, I can't make up my mind. I don't know whether I'm Mr. I'm awfully fond as you can plainly see. Before my birth, my mother had the flowers on her mind. The doctor who attended her was just so good and kind. And when he arrived, he brought the biggest pansy he could find. So that's what's the matter with me, that's all.
It will close again.
And so, in conclusion, I'll keep it brief because I've gone a little bit over in time. But I didn't make this work hoping to heal solely, but also to rather make sense and live with the wounds that I carry. And I really hope that as viewers interact with this work, that they can kind of turn inward and start to kind of nurture their own sorrows and their own joys. So thank you so much. Any questions? Yeah.
I have two questions for you, if that's okay. So a lot of your work has to do with process and like ideas from different years and like evolution. So like my first question is, and you have a lot of writing and like pieces of media. What is your like ideal way of documenting your ideas so that you're able to come back to them and like your process there?
Yeah, that's a great question. With this, when I started this body of work, I started a notebook actually that actually documented all my references so that I could go back and forth between them. Because I had read a lot of different resources, being able to put them all down in Word in a logical way was really important. Because what's really important, this is for all these studio art majors, is to keep a sketchbook, making sure to document your thoughts, because things will come up back up again. Like a lot of my work is cyclical. Even work I had been making in undergrad, which was not that good, came back into play. And so having a good documentation is really important.
And then also, what is next for you?
That's a good question. There's a couple more pieces to this exhibition that I want to make, but I'm hoping that as the work is shown, that it'll continue to be an archive, because another piece of the work is where viewers actually contribute their experiences, and then I'll compile those into a zine. So go into the resource room, document, create, draw into the composition notebooks that are provided, upload. I have a little QR code too. Upload to the archive, and then you'll receive a zine that I'll compile, and that'll be an archive for Holland as well as yourself. So if you want a zine, you have to contribute. So that's what's next, as well as some future, another work that I've already started thinking about, but I'm trying to live with this a little bit.
Yes.
Any other questions?
I want to know a little bit more about that, the triptych piece. And I know you said you created it a little before your whole idea for the exhibition came, but I was just kind of wondering where you were when you did it. Like, was it in Ohio, or like where were you?
Yeah, I was actually still in grad school then. And so I had gone back home for a holiday, and I was just walking around in family's farm, as I often do, to kind of spend time, but also find kind of images that come to mind. And that's where I stumbled upon this tree that was chewed by a beaver. And I was really enthralled with it, and then the cattails behind it. And so that was when I created that work. And then I created the pulp painting, which was massive, as you see in the exhibition, and kind of made that work there. So 2021 is when I started that piece, and then I finished it the next year. Yeah,
I don't quite know how to ask this, but bear with me.
that's fine.
I'm thinking about how you talk about layers and transparency, and that shows up really clearly in prints, in the films you're making, the other media. And then I think about clay and how non-transparent and kind of, that just seems so, it seems like in a way you're going in a different direction with that. And I wondered if you can just kind of talk about your choice of clay and
Yeah.
how you feel about that as a material.
Yeah, that's a really great question. For me, there's something with the kind of elemental nature of clay, where it's stone, and I think a lot about how permanent it is. And for me, I mean, prints are permanent as long as you take care of them. But for me, having something where it's fully relates to the body in a different way. I think for me, as I started as a painter and think about work on the wall as paintings and prints and thinking two-dimensionally, there's a different relationship with the body that is formed with two-dimensional work. And so I wanted to create something where it felt like I could feel a more physical presence. And so for me, working three-dimensionally with the deer, it was like, this piece has to be able to be walked around. It has to be solid. It has to be permanent, because I thought of this piece as kind of a monument in of itself to this experience. And so for me, that was really important. Yeah.
Kind of going off of, you said that piece needs to be walked around. Was there kind of a meaning behind that, like not putting it against the wall?
Yeah, I wanted people to be able to come up close to it. And I had originally thought maybe I would put it in the tent itself, but that would kind of put a barrier between the viewer. And so for me, I want people to be able to come up to it. And the other important part too is to create these moments of discovery in the viewer, which is why I love surface. That's why I was enamored with egg tempera painting, is that it just begs you to come up to it and live with it. And so for me, that is another extension of that with the clay work as well. Yeah.
Just to build on your question that you had about the clay versus like the drawings and the layers, I really I really enjoy like seeing your drawings with all of the line work, like the shadows and all of the shadows draped across the figure, and then how you also on the clay you use that terracage, which becomes like a skin, also a layer. And then you put that line work on with the copper wire, the steel wool, how that also puts that line work on the piece. So you're building those layers. But inside, you've also had that structure.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you are like it's just repeated over and over and over again. And I love that idea of labor. But I kind of want to see inside the piece too. And so I'm curious if you thought about like showing some of that. Like it's so layered.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a maze inside. Because I went overkill because I was worried it was gonna collapse. But it survived. Like there's only like one crack or two cracks in it. Aren't really visible. But yeah, there was something there with the structure. And that's a really interesting question because as I continued working it with different experiments in the clay sculptures, I was thinking about how I can showcase the material more. Because I did a huge deer head that I was like I was gonna hang on the wall. And I was thinking, oh God, it looks like taxidermy. And that felt really violent. And I was thinking, oh, I'm just going to lean into the stone aspect of clay. And so focusing on it being more of a sculpture and focusing on it being that, what it is. So it's interesting to think about how I can show the structure itself. Because there is so much time into it. But I have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah.
I'll do a general question, but I'm really inspired by like your multimedia approach. You have this like it's kind of intense in a way because you're working with this, really masterfully done like clay pieces, but then also you're doing this like screen printing that kind of also is collage, and then also working with performance and film. And I'm wondering kind of where you find the kind of just your drive in general to like curate that kind of practice. I like working in different kinds of media, and I'm kind of working my own way through that right now. Is it like an internal drive, or are you inspired externally by other artists to create that kind of practice?
That's a great question. It's definitely internal drive. I also really like being busy. But for for me, I'm always inspired by different artists who work interdisciplinary and seeing painters make prints is always wonderful to me. Um, and seeing how people can translate, how we as artists are translators of our work and seeing how I can shift, is really important. But it's not just, oh, I want to make pretty things and I want to do this, but they all reinforce each other. And so for me, I learned so much from painting, and that influenced the painting that I did in the Friend of Dorothy piece. And then that texture influenced my prints and made my print so much stronger. And so for me, there's like this back and forth that's really important. It does kind of drive you crazy a little bit because you're going from like the print shop to the clay studio, and it's hard to find a balance. But I think as long as you have just having clear goals, I think it was really important for me to keep my head really. And there was one more question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the opening and closing piece and how the pendulum right now is swinging in the conservative direction. There's kind of a closure and a concealability. The pendulum will swing back, right?
Yeah.
And will open back up. And I'm wondering how your perspective, your work will shift in response to that. How will your conceptual framework change?
That's great. I love that question. I think I'm definitely hoping that it changes, like the pendulum swings back. I think unfortunately the work will always be relevant because I think there's something timeless about that struggle. And so for me, I think being able to see it as a reminder, I think is important. because I think when I made the work, and well, not when I made the work, but when I was at Rhode Island School of Design, I got some flack by one of my professors who was like, "You're not in Ohio anymore. Why are you making work about this?" And I'm like, "Well, it changes." Like, and then now look where we're at. So I think it's always important to have those reminders, not as like some dark looming, like, "Oh my God, it's gonna crash" or something, but just think about, give yourself perspective so that you can enjoy it while you have it. But also being able to to remember those who have like walked before is really important. And be able to, for me, being able to to showcase some of these examples of like queer media is really important. Just to show these like amazing people that are in our culture and my lineage. Any other questions?
If you do have any more questions, please join us for the reception and you can talk to Edward up close and personal.
All right. Thank you.